Our next storyteller is going to be Sue Charters. And then after Sue tells her story, we'll take a little 10-minute break. Okay.
Thanks, Sharon. I am bothered by the fact that we do not know where Chief Miskwaaki is buried exactly. Now, why am I bothered? I am not one of his descendants. I am not a member of the Chippewas of Rama First Nation, the people he settled on the east side of Lake Couchiching. I am a member of St. James Anglican Church at the corner of Peter Street and Coldwater Road, right in downtown Orillia, on the lands where the Ojibwe once lived. St. James is a big, imposing red brick building in the Anglo settler style that defines the heritage of Orillia. I am one of the people who has buried Chief Miskwaaki twice, maybe 3 times. First time was when he died in 1864, aged 100. He was active and well until shortly before his death. He was Anglican, which is another story. And he was buried in front of the then church at the corner of Coldwater and Peter as a sign of respect. And by all accounts, he was a man to whom respect was owed. He had led some of the Ojibwe people out of expediency, forced onto that Coldwater Narrows Reserve. And he led them off only a few years later, really, and helped to establish them on the east side of Lake Couchiching, where they are now the Chippewas of Rama First Nation. The second time we buried him is still a bit in question. Harold Hale, who was a man who for 50 years was the editor of the local newspaper, the Orillia Packet. He was a strong proponent of the establishment of the Champlain Monument that Peggy was talking about. And for many, many years was a teacher in the St. James Sunday School. He wrote a piece called A Sketch of the Life of William Yellowhead. And in that piece, he says that when the present church, St. James, was constructed in 1890, a number of bodies were moved in the churchyard to make room for the excavations, that Miskwaaki's was one of those bodies, and that the exact location of his grave was no longer known. Well, I've been working with a group at St. James, working on writing a land acknowledgement that the church will use. It's taking time. And investigating our history. And one of the members of the group contacted the Anglican diocesan archivist and found a list of names of bodies that were moved at the time of the construction of the present church. And Miskwaki's name is not on the list. So where is he? Well, another local historian, David Town, put me on to the fact that Hale wrote a later piece in a book called Reminiscences. It wasn't published until 1966. And in it, he has a little section on Yellowhead's grave. He says that as a boy, he watched a body being dug up at the corner of Peter and Coldwater. And that it was said that that was Chief Yellowhead's body. Then he corrects himself and says that a friend of his, Frank Moffat, told him a different story. Frank Moffat's grandfather was an early teacher on the reserve and a friend of Miskwaki's. And when Frank was 10 years old, the grandfather showed him exactly where Miskwaaki was buried. And it's 32 feet along Coldwater Road from Peter Street and 10 feet south along Peter. Maybe Miskwaaki is still there. This squares with talk I've heard from church folks who say that an older parishioner who's gone now used to say that Miskwaaki was buried under the intersection of Coldwater and Peter, right under the intersection. And this saying was always shared with a smile. And I don't find it an occasion for humor. I have been struggling with my faith for a few years. I think if you had asked me 5 years ago, I would have told you I was a dyed-in-the-wool Anglican, too old to ever change. But then through the kindness of elders Mark Douglas and Christine Douglas and other people at Rama, I have been privileged to hear Anishinaabeg teachings and parts of the Anishinaabeg creation story told by Jim Dumont, a remarkable storyteller and teacher. I have actually never heard anything more beautiful. So, when I went to a St. James service 2 years ago and found out by chance that that particular day was a service being held in honor of Aurelia's son, Sir Sam Steele, who led the Northwest Mounted Police out to kill Métis at the time of the resistance, I left the church door vowing never to darken it again. But I did go back a year ago, and I told the story, was asked to tell a story, give them credit. I told the story of the Minjickening fish fence and how the knowledge of that important cultural place in Aurelia had been lost by so many people, myself included, lamentably. And because I told that story, I was put in touch with Mary Ann Vincent, who is with us today, and with other good people at St. James who wanted to move the church forward in writing a land acknowledgement and in discovering the truth of our troubled history. And because I was part of that group and learning the history, I looked hard at the present monument to Miskwaaki that stands right outside the front of the church. It was dedicated there in 2006 with the cooperation of the Cultural Department of the Chippewas of Rama. It seems an appropriate place to have a monument to Miskwaaki. It's large, it's imposing, right in front of the church again. It seems like an attempt to set things right. But looking at that monument has told me that we have buried Miskwaaki again, firmly, with a lie. Because it reads, a devout Christian, he donated this property for the first Anglican church on this site. And that's just not true. The Ojibwe were driven off that land in 1834, according to Mark Douglas. Mark says, we were driven off with muskets in our butts. And the first church services weren't held in the old Ojibwe meeting house, which stood right where St. James is, until 1841, 7 years later. And the Ojibwe did not receive acknowledgement as holders of the title to that land, nor did they receive compensation for having been moved off it until 2012. So, a few years ago, Mark maybe when he first found out I was Anglican, had said to me, they say that land was given, but it wasn't. It was stolen. Well, now, understanding the history, I know how we accomplished that. And I know that the real Miskwaaki has been buried by this lie again. And I think it's time that the truth came to light. I think we should find the true location of Miskwaaki's burial place. I think that perhaps his people would like to have him buried on Chief Island in Lake Couchiching, which they own. I can't imagine they would want us Anglicans to keep his body. We haven't done a very good job of protecting it so far. Now, on the webpage of Aurelia's Truth and Reconciliation Roundtable, there is a quotation I found that was developed by an Aboriginal rights group in Queensland, Australia, and read by Lila Watson at a UN conference. And it says, "If you have come to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." Well, I am not Miskwaki's granddaughter, but I find my liberation is bound up with his. And I think it's time to do this work. Thank you.